Chapter 29 outlines the presidency of Jimmy Carter all the way through the presidency of Bill Clinton. So this is a very long time period, over 2 decades, in which you begin with the Democratic president, Jimmy Carter from Georgia, followed by Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and then Bill Clinton from Arkansas, another Democrat. So 2 Democrats bookmarking a 12-year conservative presidential leadership in the middle. So let's begin with Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was Georgia Tech graduate. He was a rocket scientist. He was in the Navy. He was the governor of Georgia. He was a very Southern Baptist, unassuming, not this demagogical figure that gets up and gives big speeches and gets a crowd worked up. Very plain, sort of common guy. You sort of remember him being like at a church barbecue and just being a very plain sort of individual, which is why he was the perfect candidate for the presidency in 1976, coming off of the heels of Watergate, Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, et cetera, right? So this is a perfect guy who, while he's running for the presidency, looks into the camera during a debate with Gerald Ford, and he says to the American people, "I will never lie to you." Boom. That's what they wanted to hear, was that there was going to be that honesty and that transparency that they felt was gone in their government. But I have a lot of Jimmy Carter stories that in class I'd like to tell, but I think sort of the one that is the most unassuming is that when he told his mom he was going to run for the presidency, she said, "President of what?" That's how unassuming it was, that this was not this ambitious sort of guy. He inherits a lot of issues that are not necessarily his fault, but when you're the president and you inherit a problem, like Herbert Hoover inheriting the Great Depression, it is your job to deal with it. And the clock is ticking until the next election. And if you have not made significant progress or solved the problem, your chances of being reelected are almost none. The biggest issue of the Carter administration is the Iranian hostage crisis, as far as foreign policy is concerned. Yes, he's able to achieve the historic Camp David Accords with securing peace in the Middle East. Yes, he's able to secure SALT II, another strategic arms limitation treaty with the Soviets. But on his watch, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. SALT II is not ratified by the Senate as a result. Carter's proclamation that the Soviets' goals in the United States are the same, they want what we want, falls on deaf ears with a lot of Americans. And the Iranian hostage crisis becomes the sort of epicenter of the end of his presidency. 444 days, Americans are held captive by Iranian terrorists in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, the capital city. This is because, really, of a long series of United States or CIA infringements upon Iranian self-determination. By the 1970s, the Iranians are undergoing a revolution in which they are wanting to turn over their government to their Ayatollah. The Ayatollah is the leader of the Sharia law Islamic world that follows the Quran very strictly, is the more oppressive of the Islamic faith, specifically towards women, that believes in jihad and holy war, etc., is extremely anti-Israel, etc. This Iranian revolution is able to successfully kick out the American sort of allied leader, the Shah Pahlavi, and what leads to the hostages being taken is that the Carter administration allows for our ally, the Shah, to get on a plane and escape justice at the hands of these Iranian revolutionaries under the guise that he's coming to America to receive cancer treatment. The Iranian revolutionaries are so upset about this that they're not able to put the Shah on trial for the crimes he's committed, which are considerable against the Iranian people. And it leads to them taking the hostages. They want the Shah returned. They will not release the hostages. And the failed attempts of the Carter administration to get the hostages home becomes an albatross around his neck. And it becomes sort of the failures of American diplomacy by the end of the 1970s into the 1980s. And you really look at the bigger picture here of the Cold War. We lose in Vietnam. The Soviets are on the march in Afghanistan. We can't get our own people home when they're taking hostages in the Middle East. A lot of people start to look at the United States, within the United States, going, we got protests at home. We got a failed foreign policy. We can't win a war now. The Soviets are aggressive and expanding globally. Maybe we're going to lose the Cold War. Maybe our best days are behind us and not in front of us. Maybe we are a nation on decline. And there's sort of this malaise that is over the United States. Carter talks about it in his crisis of confidence speech. But it is, again, as great as Carter was as a candidate in 76, Ronald Reagan is the perfect candidate in 1980, because Ronald Reagan is the antithesis of this America's best days are behind it. Reagan is going to preach a message of our greatest days are in front of us. There's no dream that we cannot accomplish. We're going to win the Cold War. He rejects détente with the Soviets. He says they are the evil empire. They will end up on the ash heap of history. He says to Americans in debates with Carter, let me ask you a question. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago under Jimmy Carter? I think the answer for most Americans, it was a resounding no. There was an energy crisis, the hostages. I mean, there's just this inflation was out of control. And Ronald Reagan, under what they call the Reagan Revolution, with his base being the new right, the new conservatism, the religious right, people who wanted less change in America, less removal from its founding principles, societal values, whatever that might be, rejecting sort of alternative lifestyles, right? Reagan defeats Carter in a landslide in 1980, Carter only securing a few states, and the Reagan Revolution begins. Reagan's first thing was, we're going to fix the economy. We're going to get the economy out of this stagflation. It's called Reaganomics. He called it the Economic Recovery Plan. He gets it passed through Congress pretty much on the sympathy of the fact that he had, into the early days of his presidency, survived an assassination attempt outside of the Hilton in Washington, D.C. And essentially what Reaganomics was, we're going to cut taxes. We're going to cut taxes and roll back regulations on business and go back to this, as close as we can, to this laissez-faire sort of federal governance. And it was called trickle-down economics, with the idea being, if you cut taxes on the wealthy, they'll have more money in their pocket, they'll spend it, they'll invest it in business, it will create jobs, it'll create economic growth, and that money will trickle its way down, right? Eventually, the economic prosperity reaches all Americans. And while it didn't come instantly, it did come by the time 83, 84 rolled around. And that's going to sweep Ronald Reagan into a massive reelection in 1948, where he wins every state but one. He wins 49 out of 50 states. I mean, absolutely unbelievable to think about something like that. That was really about 40 years ago, to see a nation that was so sort of united under one candidate, that they gave him every state except for Mondale's home state. Reagan plays hardball with the Soviets in his attempt to, quote unquote, win the Cold War. He calls it peace through strength. As much as he cut funding on welfare programs and every other aspect of the federal government, he told the Defense Department, spend what you want, we'll worry about it later. The only way we can defeat the Soviets is having more nuclear weapons in them, by being stronger than them, peace through strength. He announced SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, that was jokingly called by the media Star Wars. As he called it, it was going to be a shield over the United States. Satellites with laser beams on them that would be able to shoot down nuclear missiles if they were fired by the Soviet Union. The technology is nowhere near ready for that. Recently in the news, it's been discussed again. Now it's been 40 years. But when he announced SDI, it frightened the Soviet leadership, because if Reagan were to say to the American people, we're going to build this shield, they must have the technology in the lab that they're close to it. And so it focused the Soviet economy on spending more and more into trying to replicate their own Star Wars, trying to keep up in the arms race with the United States. And it eventually leads them to turning to a reformer leader in Mikhail Gorbachev, who's going to embrace perestroika and glasnost, these reform policies politically and economically in the Soviet Union. It's going to lead them to the greatest arms treaty in the in the Cold War, the INF, which eliminated, not, it didn't decrease the amount of weapons like SALT 1 or SALT 2. It eliminated on both sides a type of missile, the intermediate ballistic missile, agreed to in 1987, that was a landmark achievement of the Reagan administration, and really went a long range towards bringing about the end of the Cold War. But for all the greatness of the Reagan Revolution, there were a lot of really negative aspects to it as well. I'll speak of one domestically and one in foreign diplomacy. The greatest, failure of the Reagan administration domestically was his inability to face the growing epidemic known as the HIV/AIDS crisis that began in the early 80s, that by the end of the 80s was killing hundreds of thousands of Americans, primarily hitting the gay male community. And because of that foundational religious right and that conservatism that was his support, that in many ways those individuals viewed this HIV/AIDS crisis as God's sort of punishment upon the quote unquote immoral activities of the gay community. President Reagan was not willing to get out in front of this at a time where, if the federal government had poured money into research to finding a cure or finding treatment for HIV and AIDS, it would have undoubtedly resulted in much less death. It took him almost his entire presidency to say the word AIDS in public and to begin funneling money into research for a cure and for treatment. This is a failure of his domestic agenda. The second being the Iran-Contra affair, which in a video like this, I cannot get into all the details on, but essentially it was this. Reagan was willing to support anti-communists anywhere. And in Nicaragua, where there was a civil war between communists and nationalists, even though there was a law, the Boland Amendment on the boards, that you could not support the Contras, the anti-communists in Nicaragua, Reagan okayed in his administration a way to sort of don't tell me about it, and to funnel money and weapons into their hands. And when this came out, this was almost something that was going to lead to Reagan being impeached. Again, credibility gap, another problem, right? Reagan was able to survive that basically by a couple of ways. Several people took the fall for him, but ultimately he got on television and said, "I'm sorry." We are a very forgiving society. He said, "I'm sorry." Nixon, to his dying day, would never say, "I'm sorry" for Watergate. That's his legacy. Reagan's legacy is he says, "I'm sorry," and he's able to go out of office with the highest approval rating since Franklin Roosevelt. That will enable his vice president, George Bush, to be able to become president easily in 1988. But ultimately, Bush will not be able to follow through on a lot of the economic promises he made, like read my lips, no new taxes. And Bill Clinton will be elected to replace him in 1992. Another president that, through very partisan sort of politics, will be impeached and then found not guilty in a trial in the Senate for lying under oath to prosecutors when they asked him about his relations with a White House intern by the name of Monica Lewinsky, right? Again, this was a very partisan issue. It was a very partisan line, the way they voted in the Senate. He was found not guilty and not removed, but it did hurt the Democratic Party when they tried to secure the White House again in 2000, which would then lead to George Bush's son becoming president in 2000. But ultimately, a massive chapter with a lot of information. This has been very front end heavy, but a nice review, a nice introduction into the details of what you'll see in this chapter.